This panel. My name is Devyn Rainwater. I'm a senior program associate at the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and I'm joined by my two panelists, Dr. Nefeli Bombotti from the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth, and George Lee, who's the director of Greenlining the Block Initiative at the Greenlining Institute in Oakland. So we're here today to talk through the themes of gentrification and displacement in relation to brownfields assessment, cleanup, and redevelopment. The revitalization of brownfield sites, which are vacant sites that are potentially contaminated and are potentially a risk or a nuisance to a community, can really transform a neighborhood street or a block or a park and provide strong community benefits. Reuse can really reinvigorate a space and provide a safe new place for residents to live, work, and play, but a beneficial reuse also has the potential to inflict lasting harm on neighborhoods through the processes of gentrification and displacement. So during this session, I'll be asking our panelists a few questions to discuss the meaning of these words, share how these themes show up in their work, and then provide us with some ideas to start addressing and mitigating displacement within land reuse. Before we get to that, I'm going to share a bit of background information on CCLR, and also I'm going to ask you all a few questions. Raise your hands to share some things. So you're probably familiar with the Center for Creative Land Recycling, as we are happily hosting you at this conference this week. We are the technical assistants to brownfields provider or TAB provider, and we are often a part of these earlier conversations in land reuse projects. We work with municipalities, community groups, tribes, and cities and counties to work through the first steps of getting your brownfields project started. And we often answer questions like what qualifies as a brownfield, or how do I access EPA funding, or what other funding streams exist. And so what I really want you to walk away with today is a refreshed goal to put anti-displacement into those early conversations as well. Community engagement is really key to establishing anti-displacement strategies from the very start of your project. And so I really want to recognize the power of a brownfield to reinvigorate a neighborhood, but also the power of a brownfield to displace or gentrify a neighborhood as well. And all of us here in this room are figuring out how to mitigate and prevent these issues. So I thank you all for being here. And another quick shout out to a resource that can really help you move through a brownfields project and insert equitable strategies and actions, especially in community engagement processes, is the Equity Guide that was put out recently by CCLR and Groundwork USA. So you can find more information about that at the CCLR table, and you can also read the guide at our table. So before I turn to my excellent panelists and ask them a few questions, I would like to get just a show of hands from the audience. If you see gentrification and displacement, or if you work with these things in your work, if this is an issue that you're navigating, I'd love to see a show of hands if this is something you're working on. Great. And I'm also curious, by a show of hands, who here has seen the effects of gentrification in their neighborhood or the neighborhood of a family or friend? Yeah, that's okay. So we know what it looks like. I'd also be curious to hear from you all at this moment, just a few words, if anyone has any ideas to share with us and our panelists before we get started. What are some snags or challenges that you face currently while you're working on these things, or that you see in your neighborhoods? If anyone has any ideas, we'd love to hear from the experts in the room. You can just shout out a few words too, anything that comes to mind to you when you think of those things. Yeah.
So our office is in Boyle Heights. Being that I was born and raised in Boyle Heights, and my business partner was also, there's a lot of movement. A lot of people from the west side, young couples are moving over. So then you get resistance from the locals. Well, why are they coming over here? Well, they're being squeezed out also from wherever they live. But it's such a balancing act. I think it comes down to that. We want to see markets. We want to see the streets cleaned up. We want to see people take care of their homes. Yet, how do you do that? And that's the toughest part. As far as for business, absolutely. Outreach is the number one thing. We've got to get our stakeholders involved and have them voice their opinion, their fears. It's often fears. But it's a real challenge.
Yeah, thank you for that excellent comment. Anyone else have anything related to challenges they'd like to share before we hear from our panelists? Or if anyone has any ideas about things that have worked for you that we could also incorporate into our discussion today. Yeah, go ahead.
Making an effort to preserve cultural history before it's lost.
Absolutely. Thank you for that point. Okay, so I can then go towards asking some questions to our panelists today. So I'd want to start off with asking you both, what do the words displacement, gentrification, and anti-displacement mean to you, and how do you see these concepts show up in your work, or show up in work that your partners are doing, and then also take a moment to introduce yourselves too. So we can start with you, Nefeli.
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity to actually speak to the wonderful audience here today. Thank you, Devyn. My name is Nefeli Bombotti. As Devyn mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. I'm an engineer by training. However, I've worked with communities since 2017, one-to-one, mostly Region 1, which means New England. So I'm really coming from far, but not too far. My expertise is in environmental remediation, brownfield redevelopment, essentially. But at the same time, we're also working with an interdisciplinary team of sociologists and planners to tackle displacement issues with regards to brownfield redevelopment. And this program that we have, which is actually EPA funded, called Brownfields Anti-Displacement Strategies, or for short BRADS program. Our mission is to basically help communities across the nation with discussing and addressing gentrification and displacement issues, and at the same time identifying anti-displacement strategies that would work for their communities. So thank you for the invitation. Would you like perhaps to introduce yourself first and then go back to the question?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I think a lot of wisdom is held kind of by my partners that I work with at Greenlining the Block. We're a climate capital projects accelerator working with CBOs, emerging CBO developers and established CBO developers in redlined communities in California, Stockton, San Diego, Oakland, and Eastern LA. And we also have some that we work with in the Midwest, interestingly in areas like Detroit, Grand Rapids. Yeah, and I've spent my whole career really working on like park and public. I was a public artist and a park developer and a landscape architect, but I've always been basically coming from this lens of the just like the deep community perspective, but also as a professional. And I just want to level set here that, this is a lived experience that I don't have. I've lived in gentrifying neighborhoods as a gentrifier, not as somebody who actually was scared of displacement. And I think that I work with community groups my whole career, so I've listened and I work and I do deep community engagement with groups, but I personally do not know what it feels like to be forced out. And I think to answer that, I think that was the question. I think one thing about gentrification other thing we need to say is, it's a racist, it's a structurally racist problem, it's a structurally classist problem, and it's really personal for every one of us because it gets down to the root of the kind of American economic system. Because like you said, it's this balancing act. Well, why is it always this balancing act? Why can't everyone just be doing okay,
And to add to these definitions of gentrification and displacement, when we talk about gentrification. And here I'll do a little bit of an academic, let's say, a lecture. And I'll go back to the very basic definition of gentrification, which is basically the influx, right? Gentrification is always the influx of residents, right, in an area due to a public or private investment. And that income, that influx, essentially, of residents, right, they may be of a different racial or ethnicity, right, different makeup, essentially. They may have, and they usually have, a higher income, higher socioeconomic status, and also higher educational attainment. So we see this influx into the area, right, that maybe, and mostly is driven by market forces. Of course, we can discuss more about, what is the deeper, let's say, cause or fundamental cause of gentrification issues. But mainly we see this happening because of the market forces that are changing in the area. And I agree with you, George, that this is, it's also a deeply personal issue of how we perceive this process. And gentrification has positive, right, and negative aspects. However, when it's tied to the displacement, because some of these processes both processes are actually highly linked, right? They are connected. Typically, and I say typically because that doesn't always happen, most times, right, displacement follows essentially, the process of gentrification. So once the influx of residents come in, then we observe, right, the displacement, which is the movement, basically, of populations from the area due to, because they cannot afford to live there anymore, and they don't necessarily benefit from all the investment that has occurred in the neighborhood. Displacement may be voluntary or involuntary, so there are many different forms. However, and again, it could be driven, right, primarily by economic forces. However, we've also seen social and cultural factors play a role. So to your point, the comment about preserving the cultural history and identity of the neighborhood, that is also, right, something that we need to factor into these processes.
Yeah, thank you both for starting us off great. Nefeli, you already touched on this a little bit about the indicators and potentially the stages of gentrification. Is there anything else that you would like to add about indicators of the process of gentrification, and then the stages of the process, and then anything else you'd like to share about the BRADS program and your research?
Sure. So when we talk about gentrification, our team started working on, first of all, focusing on the indicators where we can track different risks of displacement, and essentially focusing on the factors that can tell us where is that neighborhood change. And believe me, there is so much, out there, both from studies, academic studies that are peer review, essentially, studies where we go through, the different methodologies and the approaches that they have used to basically determine if there is a change in the neighborhood, to actual studies from the field, from practitioners where they have observed these processes occurring. So as our primary focus, as a first step, was basically to combine all these indicators where we can start seeing what is the neighborhood change. And there's no, let's say, short answer to this. There's not one indicator, there are not two indicators. We're talking about a group of variables that we can use to start tracking gentrification processes. First of all, the socioeconomic, right? When you see changes in the income, right? So that's the first kind of variable that we track. And when we say changes, we mean changes throughout time. So we look at the community at different times, and we go back, depending on the study, we go back and we identify, points at specific time where we can see, what are the socioeconomic changes from then to now. So income, it's definitely one of the main ones. Housing values, property values. We see the changes in the property values. That is, again, one aspect that would tell us if the area is gentrifying. Changes in demographics. Do we see the percentage of non-white populations decreasing? Or the other way around? Do we see that white populations are increasing in the area? Then we also factor in place-based factors. For example, what is the availability to amenities? What is the availability to public transportation, right? Businesses and jobs. And then, of course, the third group of variables, if we were to group them into three different categories, has to do with market-based factors. How many properties are available for development in the area? That's a very important parameter. That's a very important factor. And that's also where brownfields come into play, because these properties, right, if they are at the moment vacant or underutilized, awaiting for development, that's your number one target right there, to develop this property. So we need to know what is the inventory, right, of properties that can be developed or redeveloped. And of course, what did I miss? Well, actually, you tell me what I missed. Housing, right? Is there enough housing, affordable housing in the area? That's another indicator that we look at. And of course, the rents, right? Are the rents increasing? So basically tracking what the market is doing. Is it appreciating? What is happening there? So all these indicators, and there is actually a topic talk that will follow right after where we'll dive into the different methodologies on how to use these factors, which parameters, how to use them, and what considerations to account for to be able to track risks of displacement in your community. Did I cover?
Excellent. Yes, thank you so much. And then, George, I'm curious, hearing about the indicators and the stages of gentrification, I would like to ask you what you see come up in your cohort at Greenlining the Block. What challenges do you see from the community groups that you work with when they're grappling with gentrification and also implementing anti-displacement strategies? So I'm curious if you could hit some of the challenges and then also some of the strategies that are taken by these groups that you work with.
Thanks. So I'll try to answer. I'll try to do my part in answering that. I won't be able to give the full answer. But I think two things I wrote down was I was able to visit all our 24 partners, in all those areas in person this spring, and to build those trust relationships. And we had them in person for a convening. But I got to go, down on the ground. Block by block, and you're in, it's like places that I were, they're red-lined neighborhoods, so they're like visionary, good people, lots of, typically like there's culture, deep culture, sometimes visible, sometimes not immediately visible, but it's very deep. But then you're in like rough, polluted, heavy trucks, unkept streets, not due to the people, but due to kind of the conditions of a red line district. And you also see a lot of richer opportunists holding on to land, waiting for those gentrification indicators to trigger, and they're just sitting on the land waiting. So you also see kind of a frozen situation. And then I also see these beautiful victories and successes. And some of the best American neighborhoods I've been in my whole life, I love to travel, I love culture, I love people, I love neighborhood development. So honestly, I have a lot of opinions about, do I like this neighborhood or not, and I think the best neighborhoods I've been in my life often are the victories of a redline neighborhood that somehow held on to control and gone through the investment, attracted investment, but maintained control and flavor. And so, yeah, I think another thing I think I see from our communities is that there's no one there who's going to protect you. You know, the government is not going to protect you, is not protecting you. The private sector is not protecting you. And they've probably done damage in the past. So these communities, what I see is the ones that work is they take power. They just take power. They build political coalitions. They get assertive, but then they work with their institutions in an assertive way and with partnership. So I've seen, you know, there's also this feeling of you can't win either way. If you don't build the infrastructure, you have a community without parks. You have a community with dirty streets and abandoned cars. You have a community without a community center, without a library. That's not a healthy community. If you build those things, wealthier white people will see those things, and then they will use their higher resources to buy bargains in your neighborhood and colonize your neighborhood. So there are really different models of gentrification. There's kind of colonist gentrification, and then there's kind of community-controlled and managed gentrification. And that's where I think it's important to break down the word of gentrification to be more precise. Everyone just kind of throw the word, oh, it's gentrifying, that's gentrifying, that's gentrifying. It's like, let's be more precise about what's happening, because colonial gentrification says, I don't care about the people who are there, I just want money for my real estate, I do not care about those people. Economic development is, this neighborhood's getting better and the people can stay here and they can maintain their culture and the heritage. And yes, it'll change, but there's also like flavor and housing. So that's a little bit of what I've seen. And again, I mean, I think the wisdom goes down to the field. Like City Heights CDC is here. In San Diego, they have a displacement guide. So maybe you should be up here, Jesse. But
Great, thank you so much, Georgia, for those comments. Also talking about anti-displacement strategies, Nefeli, I'd love to ask you, what are some policy-based anti-displacement strategies that you've seen in your work, and also through the BRADS program, working with folks as a technical assistance provider, what type of technical assistance and strategies do you offer folks?
Thank you for that question. Actually, before we go into the anti-displacement strategies, which is really, the solution, right? This is how we approach the topic of like, what are the solutions to this? I would like to make a comment on, what you were saying, George, about the process of gentrification, because it feels that, you're damned if you do, right? You're damned if you don't. That's what we see, and actually it was a kind of like an inside joke with my team. We are putting together a guide that talks about identifying the different indicators, and it seems that it's really that balance, that fine balance of, okay, if I don't do the development, then we're going to have a community without the infrastructure that they need. But if we do the development, then what happens? How do we actually prevent or mitigate at least the displacement of people who live there? So, and to understand this and to actually provide solutions of what can happen, I think one has to think of all the different stages of gentrification. And gentrification is not a linear process. It's highly non-linear, but sometimes finding a linear model helps our minds process, at least some of the stages. So when starting talking about an area where there's a decline of infrastructure, we kind of like define this as the first stage, right, where there is abandoned properties, right? How many of you have communities with brownfield sites and a lot of abandoned properties or underutilized properties? That, yeah, a lot of them? Mm-hmm. So you're at the right place at the right moment, because we'll be talking about strategies to actually implement at that stage. So you often see the decline, right? The decline in market. You often see these abandoned properties, and at that stage, they may be around the area. Now, California, I know it's a little different, but at that time, there may be inexpensive housing around the area, because the area is in decline, right? The market is in decline, and that's where people identify the opportunity to actually move into an area where there is cheap housing, perhaps some like small, scale renovations, and then that's where the market starts to rise, right? Because people see that opportunity. So that sometimes we see this process defined as the first influx of people, the first round of gentrifiers, and then as people see more and more of that opportunity, then you have more developers coming to the area, investing more and more and more, and then that drives the property values up, right? And that's where things are becoming very dynamic. So that influx of higher income populations with typically higher educational attainment, that's when it happens. That's where these dynamic processes occur. And at some point, right, you realize that, oh, where are these people coming in? Well, all the different, let's say, abandoned properties in the area are either transformed into housing or other amenities that the community needs, and that's where you reach kind of like saturation. And that's kind of like the last stage. Again, the process is not as linear as I described it. However, sometimes it helps us again, follow through, the different stages. Now, to determine at what stage your area, your neighborhood, your community may be, it may not be as clear, right? It may not be as clear because it's not always about the market, right? So that's where we use the different indicators to track different risks of neighborhood essentially change. And when it comes to the solution, right, to those anti-displacement policies that we discuss, and why do we actually consider those a solution? Well, if you don't intervene, right, basically you won't be able to control the market, and gentrification happens, and you may have involuntary displacement, essentially. But those anti-displacement policies come as a mitigation measure to be able to intervene at its stage and help the residents in the area to basically get the benefits of that redevelopment. So when we talk about anti-displacement strategies, we're talking about a group of strategies. It's not, the most common that you probably heard is, and I would say one of the most important factors, right, is to actually have or preserve affordable housing in the area, right? Subsidized housing, to make sure that there is enough affordable housing so that the people can afford to live there. Now, if you have a community where there is a high percentage of renters, that community may be more at risk. So we'll look at renters, percentage of renters in the area, and of course, what is happening with the rents with a closer look, because that is also a determinant of vulnerability, right? This is a particularly vulnerable group because a landlord, right, may decide to raise the rent, right? What happens then? People cannot afford and they're being displaced. A possible measure when it comes to that, a possible policy, and the displacement policy that could be implemented to prevent that is to actually have, right, a tenant protection policy, right? An eviction an eviction policy which essentially limits the landlord's ability to evict people. So that could be one of the solutions. Tax abatement programs where people can have the financial, essentially, incentive to improve their houses. They may have tax reductions. That's another policy that is implemented. And of course, inclusionary zoning, right? So that you can have the affordable housing units within your residential plans. At the same time, that basically we refer to these type of policies as tenant and homeowners protection policies. However, there are other models and other approaches where we build collective ownership within the community, right? Either with a community land trust, right, or through a community benefits agreement. Have you heard of community benefits agreements before? Yes, familiar? Have you ever drafted one? Yes. So perhaps you can share with us at the end some of the challenges drafting a community benefits agreement. So this type of work is actually what we do at the BRADS program. So our program is both research, developing resources for communities, but also providing technical assistance to limited communities across the nation. So if you're interested to working with us, of course, I mean, I would definitely refer you first to CCLR, reach out to your TAP provider, CCLR, and then perhaps we also have another discussion to basically work together, focusing particularly on displacement, mitigating displacement related to brownfields redevelopment.
Awesome. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm having trouble keeping track of the questions. I wanted to make sure I've got a list of all the amazing things CBOs are doing to do anti-displacement.
Absolutely. Yeah, take it away, Nefeli. You touched on one of my questions too of wealth building and also retaining home ownership and encouraging affordable housing and ways to do that. So that's oftentimes a strategy towards anti-displacement. So absolutely, George, if you have any additional comments, I'd love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, I think when Nefeli and I and Devyn were preparing for this, I think there is kind of like, there's a difference on being like kind of field perspective, research perspective. And I think, I feel like I don't fully know like the breadth of anti-displacement techniques out there, but there are a lot. So I think what I can do for my part here is to explain some of the things I've seen working by CBOs, community-based organizations, in concert with their governments, with their politicians, with their private entities. I'll do that. Some of these slides go over it, but I'm going to kind of just rattle a few off quickly. Casa Familiar down at the border, San Ysidro, they're combining, they're doing rent-to-own LIHTC housing, working with the state. So LIHTC is the big tax credit program that basically is the main mechanism for building affordable housing. The problem is it's all rentals. So there's no wealth generation is going to happen there. So they're doing rent-to-own LIHTC where they're going to own the land. But they're not just doing that. They're basically kind of building. They've been working there and hiring people from the community for I think like over a couple decades, and they've just slowly become the developer that communities that are facing displacement are afraid of is going to come and take over their neighborhoods. CASA is basically, and I see other groups doing this, like City Heights CDC, they're taking steps to become the developer, to get involved with those cuts of the money, to leverage the public side, to leverage the private side, but all with in-house and community staff. And what you're seeing down there at San Ysidro is you're seeing one of the best communities in America being built. It's literally one of the best communities in America being built. It's highly active transport, it's all campus. They got a theater, they got resilience hub. And as I tell you this, eyes are going to start to go to San Ysidro for gentrification, but they got a lockdown down there. They got some power, political power. So GES in Denver, they started out doing modular housing with a crane. They work with Latina elders, and they basically had a problem. There's like 3 lead smelters in their neighborhood, and they're starting to get cleaned up. There's lead everywhere, and they like had to take the first 6 feet of ground off everyone's property because it's full of lead. But now they're like, that's been abated, and they have this crazy history, but they're basically building like these modular housing units that are going to be community land trust. They're stacking them, so they're doing dense, low cost, value production housing. And then that's grown to now they're doing a city partnership mega block with an EPA community change grant that's going to have a library and a community center on a ground lease that they're going to own on the ground floor. That's going to have and when people say affordable housing, you got to, let's be precise. Because are you talking about deeply affordable housing, or you're talking about barely qualifying as affordable housing so you can make that pencil out, Because you want that deeply affordable housing. You want that percentage. Maybe not always. I'm not an expert, but it's important. And then I think one of the coolest things is actually before Greenlining the Block, up in Washington State. I lived in Seattle 13 years. I'm from Boston, so I'm from New England. But up in Seattle, in the Chinatown up there, Chinatown, Japantown, Filipino town, all mashed together in this one area. They basically, through Asian exclusion acts, they were legally not allowed to buy land. And so they developed shell corporations to buy land like in the 40s. And they were called like the mob, but basically they weren't the mob, they were just immigrants forming shell companies to get around the system. And that's basically grown to now it's a huge public development authority. It's state authorized. It's a state law that allows a few public development authorities in the state to actually, they can issue municipal bonds. They own 4 rental affordable housing units. There's another CDA that owns units. They built a park, all CBO led, but they own a lot of that land around, and they support all those small businesses around that park. And they have political power. Their senators are scared of them. Their senators like them, and they also have this thing called the International Special Review District. They have a geographic line around the whole Chinatown, Japantown, Filipino town area, and it says if you want to build here, you got to go through our regulatory board. And people complain about the regulatory board, but I had to go through them a lot, and actually I was like, this board is fine. This board just makes sure that good stuff's being built that preserves the heritage in this neighborhood, which is their greatest amenity. And that neighborhood, again, highly pedestrian, highly climate friendly. And then we have other groups like the Tongva Conservancy, the Tongva people in these land acknowledgements. The Tongva people are a partner, and they got a land back house up in the Pasadena Hills, and they've just putting a foothold in. I mean, they got real displaced. And so they're just a lot of our organizations, they have a vision, they're putting a foothold in, and they're going to grow up to be the SCIPTAs, these big development corporations, I think, and working with their institutional partners, the cities and the government. So those are just some really good examples. So I think there's a lot to be positive about. I mean, I think, but again, we'll talk about it later. There's bigger problems too. The whole wealth distribution is an issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can touch on that as well, George, if you have more comments now before we get into questions.
Okay. I think that a big thing, again, at the beginning that we talked about is I think gentrification. So I'm going to get personal. My mother is she's a second-generation Italian immigrant. I'm half Italian. And she grew up in a cold flat in Brooklyn with a single mother, and to pay for housing, she'd go down and shovel coal into the burner. And New York has a bunch of dense housing because they just built a lot of housing for all these immigrants coming in through Ellis Island. They were just we're just gonna build. And now even in New York, you can find it's more affordable there than it is in San Francisco, and there's a bunch more people living there than the whole Bay Area because they have the production units, they built the housing. And my mother lived in public housing in Williamsburg, which is completely gentrified now, but she lived in one of the first public housing authority buildings, and housing authorities play a role. You got to house people, and I think that immigrant mentality, she also is that immigrant mentality where it's I don't care about gentrification. I get what's mine. I get what I need to get the best for my family. But I think the problem is that there's not enough, like we have these quintiles up here. Wealth in the United States has gotten totally out of control with distribution. I don't know if we can pull up this, but anyway, like wealth's totally out of control. Basically, like, are you guys familiar with quintiles? You ever heard of a wealth quintile? So I just want to go over this real quick. But basically, they're like dividing a pie into 5 slices, with the richest 20% getting the biggest slice, and the poorest 20% getting the smallest. So it's how we think about how wealth is shared. And so the next slide, this is the state of America. So the bottom 50% is that tiny yellow thing. And then once you pass the blue and go into the gray, yellow, and green, that's just 90% and up. So gentrification is a mirror of our economic system. So until we fix our economic system, we're going to have gentrification and displacement. So we can continue to put Band-Aids all over the place, and we see our CBOs doing the good work. We see cities doing the good work, but we gotta fix that. And however we do it,
Thank you, George.
Thanks everybody for listening to me.
Okay, so as we are close to getting some questions from you all, I'd just like to ask both of our panelists a final question, and also pose this question to the audience if you'd like to address this too when we get into the Q&A portion. What would you say, to all of us here, what is the first step towards anti-displacement? If folks in the room are new to these strategies or policies, what's one action item that folks sitting here today can walk away with? And also want to acknowledge the likely expertise that we have in the room with us today. So if you'd like to share any comments during Q&A, any recommendations as well, we'd love to hear that. So why don't you go, Nefeli?
Sure. So as a first step, if you can define one first step, awareness is key, but action is more important too. So action, remember the book, Just Action? That we saw today. I think take the first step and bring up your concerns for displacement to either the municipalities or developers. Don't be afraid to speak up, right? And I would also like to mention that gentrification and displacement, right? These two processes are highly, highly connected to actually redlining and previous past discriminatory land use policies of the past, so they're highly an environmental justice issue. Right? We didn't talk a lot about this, but they are highly connected. So if this book here, From the Ground Up, essentially describes, have you seen this? Have you read this book? I definitely recommend it. That's essentially, the studying materials as a takeaway point out of this session. Understand how environmental justice works, and that will also help you understand what is the next step to tackle displacement.
And George?
One thing. Yeah.
I know that wasn't one thing.
It's a tough question.
Yeah, I think for who? For everyone?
Yeah, I'd say for the folks in this room.
Yeah, so for the folks in this room. I one thing. Form a very small group and start talking about what you can do. One thing that I'm trying to do in my own personal life is, what's your part in the solution? The problem is too big for you. The problem is too big for any one of us. Get a small group together. Don't be afraid of your institutional partners. Don't be afraid of your grassroots CBOs from a neighborhood you're not from. Just get people together, be nice, listen, and talk about the problem and see what you can do.
Excellent, thank you so much. And so now I'd love to turn it over to questions from the audience. If anyone has a question, there's a microphone in the middle of the room, so we'd love to hear from you. Anyone feeling brave? Oh, I see we got one.
I noticed that a lot of the anti-displacement strategies seem to focus on residential displacement, but have you experienced, or are you familiar with any successful commercial anti-displacement policies?
That's an excellent question, and we're actually discussing about that with Devyn and George previously. So there are many communities that are concerned with displacement of businesses. It's not only about residences. But as you mentioned, as you noticed, the majority of anti-displacement policies refer to the residents, right? Either homeowners or renters. So what happens with the businesses, right? Where do the businesses fall under? And the short answer to that is under the community benefits agreements, where you could also include business owners there, because you can draft the agreement as it fits with essentially the needs of your community. But there are not many other solutions out there. There's more work to be done and more research on that aspect. But as a short answer, I would say, community benefits agreements would be perhaps the best vehicle to tackle that. Great question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It makes me think of a partner. I don't think it's a full reaction, but Grand Rapids, we had partners there, and it's brownfield. It's a brownfield story. Ned from Communities for Collaboration, C4 in Grand Rapids, incredible organization. They need a lot of partnership, very small partnership ecosystem. He was telling me the story about how there are a lot of POC-owned small businesses that would make, doodads, parts for the big three automakers. Little garages here and there, they make all the doodads, they put it on the train would go over to the big three. But then what he told me is his perspective was then NAFTA happened, and it just sucked all the jobs out of Grand Rapids like a vacuum cleaner and sent them down to another outside the country. And that displaced all the POC businesses in that area. And now those brownfields are totally inaccessible to his organization and POC people because it's so expensive to approach that many lots. Each individual lot is polluted. And so that's actually forcing basically more of like a corporate gentrification engine from a local billionaire family in Grand Rapids. So I don't know if that does the commercial thing, but I haven't answered your commercial question. But that's a great question, because residential gentrification also often can happen in industrial areas and just like push them out into other industrial areas.
Thank you so much for that question. Anyone else have any thoughts or questions?
Hello. Thank you for mentioning tenants' protections. I feel like this is one of the first times I've heard anyone in the whole conference talk about it. And I also appreciate you making the connections between housing and environmental justice, because that is very real. Affordable housing is amazing, and we definitely need it, especially for acutely low income. Also, though, we are replicating decades of environmental racism by, housing people of color on top of contaminated lands. My question is, what do you say to developers when there's pushback? So locally in LA, we're working on building decarbonization, and we've been meeting with the city offices, and there's been a lot of pushback around making sure that developers are holding on to the costs and not passing those on to tenants when those retrofits for electrification kick in. So what do you say to developers to ensure that they hold on to the costs and don't pass it on to tenants during electrification? Because if they are passed on to tenants, then that is a form of, they can get displaced, they can get evicted because they're not able to cover those costs.
I think that's an excellent question. And in general, in every project and brownfields redevelopment project, there is always that I would say, I wouldn't say battle, but that continuous, let's say, negotiation process with the developers. And we have been in numerous discussions with communities where even the cities, the municipalities essentially are afraid of bringing up this type of policies, right? Because they're afraid that the developer is going to run. Right? They're afraid that, if we push too much, if we bring up the issue of we have to protect our renters and our homeowners here, there's going to be pushback, and that's going to kill the deal. However, right, it's a very difficult discussion to navigate. I would say, right, that you need to, have allies in the municipality and other CBOs. Make sure that you form either a small group or a big group of partners to advocate for that. Make sure that you bring up the argument that if this doesn't happen, people will get displaced. As clear as it is. And if that developer runs away from that project, then, okay, perhaps it was not the right person, right? It was not the right person to do that development. It's a very difficult, I hear you, it's a very difficult process. I don't know if you have anything else to add from perspective.
Oh yeah, the only thing that makes me think about it is to understand where people are being displaced to. So to add to the people are being displaced, well then there's kind of that idea so what? Maybe they're going to a place that's okay. But it's maybe we should figure out more about where folks are going and what are the infrastructure levels there? Is it worse? Is it better? And in addition to that, displacement is also just emotional. Again, I haven't lived that experience, but what folks have communicated is that being displaced or a long period of time is a traumatizing experience, especially when it's basically race motivated. I think the other thing that came up there, but my mind is floating away. I can't remember what I was going to say.
That's okay. Maybe we can come back to you in sidebar. Go ahead.
Hi, I noticed on one of your slides it showed that gentrification tends to be happening in cities that are on the West Coast and East Coast and Gulf Coast. To what extent do political policies in basically blue states have they contributed to gentrification over time? You were talking about, where do these people go? Well, there's a lot of statistics that are showing that people are going from blue states to red states.
One thing I'm really proud about actually is the state of Washington. The state of Washington basically actually ended single-family housing. California has not ended single-family housing. SB 9 is a fake bill to a certain extent because the setbacks that are required to actually split a single-family lot that were snuck into SB 9 basically make it semi-impossible or extremely difficult to actually build housing using SB 9. I think I have that bill correct. What Washington did is it said, hey, if you're a city over a certain size, no more single family. You have to at least allow 4 units, and you're not allowed to do a whole bunch of tricks to make sure nobody moves in. You can only regulate certain things, and if you're close to transit, you do 6 units. And I think that blue states, I'm from the Bay Area. I think the Bay Area is one of the most inequitable and unjust areas I've ever lived in my entire life. When you look at Richmond, you look at East Oakland, you look at the wealth disparity, it is embarrassing, it is terrible, it is wrong. And a lot of that is because we just excluded production of housing. And you need to get rid of single-family housing. Blue states need to do better. Blue states are screwing up on this, but red states are screwing up on a lot too.
All right, so we've got about a minute left. 30 seconds left. You better go quick. So if we don't finish your question, or feel free to come talk to us after the session as well.
Yeah, sure, of course. I guess mine is less of a question, I think, on the topic of anti-displacement strategies. So I'm with Genesis LA. We are a community development financial institution. And so part of our strategy has really been to take a little bit more of a proactive approach as it relates to gentrification. So for example, up in the Northeast San Fernando Valley, the light rail is going to be driving right through certain communities. And so what we're doing is we're partnering with anchor communities that already live in these neighborhoods and know the vision for their community, and sitting them across the table with experienced developers in that region, and us serving as the lenders to kind of create this super team, if you will, to drive the developments forward in a way that the community feels like they're in the, not feels like, they are driving the steering wheel at that point. Because development is typically opportunistic by nature. It's, oh, there's a property for sale, let's go grab that. We work with the community, ask their opinion. What color do you want the building? Okay, cool, thanks. And then they move on to the next project. Whereas this effort that we're trying to do is more like, we're gonna work in this neighborhood, what do you guys need? And it's a lot of that conversation of, okay, you might need a grocery store, but does that actually work? And you're sitting across from the developers, and they can kind of walk you through that process of, does it actually pencil? Is the lot actually big enough to support a grocery store? And having that type of conversation to educate each other on expectations versus the reality of things. And then of course, Genesis being the ones who can be flexible to provide the financing if something were to be able to move forward with that. So for us, we've chosen to have us all sit at the table and have that kind of conversation to build that trust, whereas most of the time in the development world, we're often working in silos. So I just want to share that strategy.
I have like a micro crush on Genesis LA. I want to get to know you guys better. Yeah, because also with the EPA Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund loans, you're going to see CDFIs accessing, like Debbie was saying earlier, the decades in a week. The GGRF loans are going to come through these CDFIs like a fire hose, and they could build green social housing, and they have to go to disadvantaged communities. And that's definitely an opportunity. Genesis LA, groups like Genesis LA are like CBOs being assertive on steroids and being extremely collaborative across all aisles, I think. So I encourage people to check that group out.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for your input. Thank you for your questions. And thank you all so much for being here for this session. It's been really fun for me. So thank you so much. We have to wrap up. But I am now the MC for this room, so I'll give you an update on the next sessions that are coming after a 15-minute break. I believe we'll have topic talks in this room. So 15 minutes. Oh, yeah, and thank you. Give a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Devyn. Thanks to Philly.
Thank you both, and the audience for staying now.